when black people wake up and become intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, as other humans are intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, then the black man will think like a black man, and he will feel for other black people. And this new thinking and feeling will cause black people to stick together.
Truth seekers, please understand, Mental Dialogue is much more than just a talk show. Each and every Saturday, we communicate with you for two reasons: to dialogue and connect. On the dialogue side, we cater to you intellectual outcasts who feel you have no place for honest discourse on race, sex, culture, and African American business. On the connect side, we've created a community where you can connect with experts specifically in finance, whether personal or business, and mental health, whether it's trauma or to optimize performance, along with all the other skill sets from other MD community members. Our mission was to create a virtual nationwide neighborhood where African Americans learn to trade ideas, goods, and services through social media, meetup, and this podcast. To become a neighbor of the Mental Dialogue Community Club, please visit us at mentaldialogue.com. We are better with you than we are without you. We can be neighbors even though we don't live next to each other. Hashtag raise the culture.
What's up, everybody? It's your boy Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates, and welcome to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. This is our first video show, so hope y'all are enjoying or liking the new format as we are making an upgrade. I'll call this Mental Dialogue 2.0. I am your mental activist, and so you already heard the intro, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our special guest. Brother's been on the show many a times, Attorney Edward Hopkins. Thank you, King, for being with me this morning. If you will, I'm gonna go ahead and let you introduce yourself, and we're gonna get right into this morning's discussion question. If you are a first time listening to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, we do take a Socratic method to all of our conversations we have on race, sex, and culture. So we answer a discussion question for the morning. Before we let the cat out the bag, tell them about yourself, brother. Attorney Hopkins, thank you, King, for being with us.
Black Socrates, Montoya, good morning, brother. My name is Ed Hopkins. My legal name, the name I put on all the legal documents, is Edward C. Hopkins Jr., but people who know me call me Ed. Ed Hopkins. I'm a civil rights attorney. I also do defamation law. I office in Colorado and I practice in Colorado and Georgia. And the reason why I do the kind of work I do should be obvious to those who are tuning in. I'm here to help folks who need a little bit of help navigating through their American experience. And some of us have to work hard to uphold the rights that America says everyone's guaranteed. So that's what I do for a living.
Nah, I love it. I always say, as a mental activist, I'm the bridge between, if you will, thought to action. And so when you're in the field as a civil rights lawyer, you are actually out there doing it, if you will. And so I like to highlight people like yourself who are actually doing the work, if you will. As we do on Mental Dialogue, we take a psychological approach, if you will, to these conversations. So to let the cat out the bag on this morning's discussion question, it is simply: warranted or unfair? Black folks got to do better, right? Warranted or unfair, Black folks got to do better. And so that's a phrase we hear all the time, Brother Ed, if you will. We got to do better, right? And so I reached out to you a couple of months ago because I was a little upset about hearing that term. It was actually, I was actually looking at, if you will, a financial literacy conversation online, and the person leading the class kind of highlighted how other groups are, if you will, more financially literate. There's these things that they do, and it just kind of highlighted before starting the class, if you will, what we don't do, and then started teaching. And it upset me because I see it quite happen quite often. And I called you on a personal call, and I said, man, I got to do something with this. And you agreed to be on this morning show. And so I wanted to dig into this. We got to do better. But what we do quite often, if you've ever listened to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, we'll listen to clips and react. So I'm going to have Ed, just so y'all know, as our special guest. He may have seen some of these clips, but for the most part, I don't know. So these are live reactions to these clips in reference to this morning's discussion question: warranted or unfair? Black folks, we got to do better, right? So I just want to start out with this clip to give some context and just get your thoughts as we get into this conversation about that terminology and what it means to us. So let me find this cut, play it real quick, and we'll get Ed's reaction, because again, I think it sets a decent context for the show.
African Americans are a completely unique phenomenon as a people. Who they are culturally, what their history is, what their experience is, isn't duplicated anywhere on earth. You don't know where you came from. You don't know what country you came from. You don't know what culture you came from. You don't know what language you came from. You don't know what your religion was before. You, like I've said before, you're more American than anyone because you don't have any other identity. Actually, your entire identity is American-based. That's not the case of anyone else. I'm Irish American, I'm German American, I'm Italian American, I'm Jewish American, I'm this or that, the other. You can say African American, but you don't know anything about Africa. You don't even know which part of Africa. Africans don't call themselves that because I know my tribe. I have my language. I have my region, my country, my whatever. Like me saying European American. I'm not European. I'm specifically Irish and German. But you can't say that. You are American. You're the original Americans. You know, everyone else is immigrants. You can't even be called immigrants. Yeah. You know, you're originally American, and your culture is as close to being the indigenous culture of America as there can be without you being the indigenous people.
So I set the context, brother, because the thing that stands out to me, and I'll let you obviously give your thoughts on it, but the thing that stands out the most is this is, and for what I understand, his name is Shahid King Bosun, popular YouTuber, if you will, and we'll play some other cuts from him as well. But the thing that stood out for me and why I wanted to open with that is because I feel like that what he appropriately lays out is the uniqueness of the African American experience, Black, whatever the case you want to call us, but he lays out the uniqueness in the experience. And I would offer today in discussing We Got to Do Better, that it's the uniqueness in the experience that sometimes I think we fail to understand, because we'll say quite often that race is a social construct, and it is that, but I think there's some things that we misunderstand about it, in my opinion, and we don't always recognize that unique position that we have. And sometimes I would say we look down on ourselves in a way that we shouldn't, because we don't always understand the unique position that Shahid Bosun laid out. Your thoughts, King?
When you have this conversation with people who are not African American, with people who have not lived a few decades in dark brown skin, who don't have the type of phenotypical traits that Americans associate with the group they call, or we call, Black Americans or African Americans, well, you don't have all those combinations of experience. When you haven't lived it through the skin, through the features of a Black American, it is difficult for you to correctly frame most of the things that you say as a theorist about the Black American experience. Combine that with the fact that none of us has direct access to the experiences of our ancestors. We can only read the history books. We can only glean from those good history books what those experiences must have been like. When you combine all of our ignorances with what our experiences are, you can see a little bit of truth in what he said, but I also see a lot of falsity in what he said. So on the truth side, is our experience unique? Well, if you're arguing with a staunch conservative that wants to persuade the audience that Black people have a better deal here than any Black people, any Africans in the history of the world, they're going to start with the position that we're wealthier here in the United States than we are everywhere else. And what I mean, we, people of African descent. He's going to say that our laws are protective. We got civil rights laws that ensure that the law applies equally to everybody. That's not quite how it works out in reality, but we have laws on the books that say that's how it's supposed to work out. And then he's going to say things along the lines that you have every opportunity, and if you're not rich in America while Black, is because you got a cultural problem. Your mama didn't teach you how to act right. That's the essence of the argument. There is some truth to that, and that's why you have these debates. Brothers and sisters who do not want to embrace that kind of narrative will push back harshly. We will push back by saying things such as, well, what about racism? What about the 1800s? What about the 1700s? What about the 1900s. We just can go through history. What about the law? What about what they did after World War I, after World War II? What about all of these ways the government helped people who were not African descent get richer so much more quickly during the 20th century than all the other groups? What about that? And then you go back and forth until everybody exhausts themselves and they go home and take a nap. But the thing that I think we should really focus on here is what the facts show that is difficult to refute. What the facts show is that people of African descent whose bloodlines have been here since the 17th century, those bloodlines have had a different experience than the African bloodlines that didn't get brought to the United States, or we should say America, in the 17th century. America was, the land was there, but the United States wasn't formed until later. So all of those bloodlines have a different experience. On top of that different experience, the nation that was created in the 18th century, that nation started off building disadvantage into its core law, its constitution. So it starts the competition. We are a new nation from this point forward. Everybody is going to have all these rights, but you dark-skinned folks, you're going to have lesser rights. We're not going to kill you. Well, we might if you get out of line, but we're not going to give you the full fair opportunities that everybody else here who's not Black is going to have. And we're going to see how this plays out over the next couple centuries. Everybody who thinks that their bloodlines were going to be successful if they were put in those types of circumstances needs to think again. So the bloodlines were put at a great disadvantage starting in the 18th century, but before that. And then you get laws, interpretations of laws that put the pressure, suppress their economic opportunities even more. Centuries and centuries of this. And then we arrive at today, and we're having this debate as to whether or not any kind of program or policy that is designed to correct those past injustices must be racist. That's the narrative we get from the other side. So when I hear folks like that talk like that, and I think I saw that video, I listen patiently and I try to glean what you're getting right and what you're missing. He does both. He gets some things right that is going to be good for conversations like these, but he also gets some things wrong, and he doesn't fully, in my opinion, appreciate the full scope and arc of the African experience in the American land since the 17th century.
Not fair enough. And I love all of that context. Again, we just want to do the deep dive. And what I consider the deep dive, just to even give this context, if you will, for this show, the deep dive is ultimately, in my opinion, understanding the psychology of those debates, these debates that we can have about whether we need to do better or not. Or like you said, when you get into a political argument and you start using the political narratives to discuss race, if you will, and quite often it's two things: not understanding or knowing history from our own perspective, if you will, just kind of sometimes only knowing history as it was delivered in public school, if you even cared about it, if you will. And then the other aspect is the psychological effect. Like, some things can literally, people will say, well, that was 400 years ago. And there are remnants from a psychological standpoint that still apply. I'm going to play some cuts where I think that will have to be recognized, if you will. But I want to talk about we got to do better, or we need to do better, when I hear it typically in current context. For example, the one that I remember the most, I ended up doing a video show on this some years ago, if you recall, the killing of a Nipsey Hussle, if you will, the rapper artist, if you will. And so after he was killed, after kind of starting to get recognized on the music end, but he got highlighted for all the business moves that he was making in reference to uplifting his community out in South Central LA, if you will, the Crenshaw Boulevard area, if you will. And so not only did people discover his music, but they saw that he was a big innovator. And so his loss was very untimely, as he was kind of getting known to more people musically, but it was his business acumen that was acknowledged and his love for his community that was acknowledged. And so when he, unfortunately, at his unfortunate demise, there were all these comments all across the nation, specifically in our community, about we have to do better. And so I use that example because the racial construct makes us, because of our Black American experience, quite often we over-identify with, if you will, our heroes to the extent that we feel like we lost a part of us. My however is, due to our African American experience, we are, if you will, the only race or the only group that over identifies with one person in that manner. So there, like, for example, I looked on Wikipedia because I use this example on purpose for like all of the musicians that have been killed that are known. Nipsey hadn't got famous enough to make Wikipedia, if you will, but there were 5 black artists, if you will, Marvin Gaye, Tupac, Chris Wallace, that are more known, that were on that list. 5 that I knew, and maybe some other black ones, but there were 59 musical artists that lost their lives or were murdered over the course that are covered on Wikipedia. 5 out of 59. I'm highlighting that because when other cultures lose an artist, they may be upset from the standpoint that they love their music, but those cultures or those races don't start saying, oh, look at how we treat each other. We got to do better. And I wanted to highlight that the racial construct makes us, due to struggle, over identify in a way that I consider unhealthy, because unfortunately that situation with Nipsey was a one-on-one situation based on his personal past. And while I love him and he's one of my favorite artists, I don't identify being from South Carolina with the idea that look at how black people do, when I don't know anybody that's walking around that's gotten away with a murder or that will even have considered doing that to Nipsey. That's the reality of all groups, but we down ourselves by saying we have to do better anytime we lose a musical artist, as if it's an indictment on our entire community. That's what I wanted to drop off to you.
Yeah, I like that argument. I like the thrust of that argument. One of the things that I often think about is, where would we be today but for our excellence? Where would we be today but for our excellence? When people talk about how much better we could be doing, I often start with, compared with whom? Compared with whom? With what is the other group that you are going to compare us with if you want to do an apples to apples comparison? You have no group. And I'm not going to try to compare how poorly the world has treated different groups. Every group has a story. But when it comes to the American project, this American enterprise, when you talk about the centuries of it, just the length of it, the length of the defamation against the group, the length of the legalized economic oppression against the group, the length of the domestic terrorism against the group, it is difficult for anybody to make a credible argument that any other group has suffered more of what America has to offer when it wants to do its worst. It's very difficult to imagine another group that has absorbed and excelled in spite of more. So I don't buy the narrative that we need to do better. I always focus first on how excellent we must be already to be as successful as we are in this particular enterprise that has done so much harm to our bloodlines for so many centuries. But then I do look on the flip side. How can we improve even faster? How can we improve even faster than we're improving now? We're showing the entire world what happens when you have an excellent group of people who are put under some of the worst circumstances that the modern world can throw at them. What is possible when they are excellent, when they come together, when they lock arms, and when they strive in spite of all these difficulties, these vicissitudes over centuries? We're showing the world how excellent a group can be. And when I think about it that way, how much more excellent can we be? Well, there are things that we can improve on, but we're not doing bad. We are not doing bad. We're doing excellently. And when you are doing excellently, it's easy to criticize you for not being perfect. So when I see it this way, then I don't buy that narrative, and I think about what can we do steadily to improve our circumstances in the United States, generation after generation, without condemning one another, without pointing the finger at one another, and while celebrating what we've already achieved and what we are achieving on a daily basis with each other's help. That's how I look at it, brother. And I wish more of us looked at it that way, rather than starting with that negative, false, fallacious argument that we need or should be doing better. We're already doing excellently.
And let's play another narrative, because that's in fact what leads to story. Narratives, propaganda actually become embedded in our thought process. And my biggest concern for doing this show was to improve our narrative so that we don't tell the next generation these false narratives. And here's a popular one. And with you being an attorney, this is a perfect one for you. I'm just going to play a portion of another cut from Shahid Bosen, if you will. And this is a very popular back and forth politically in reference to our community talking about murder, if you will.
Blacks commit more crimes than whites do.
Okay, well, first of all, what he means by blacks commit more crimes is, in fact, that African Americans are more often convicted of committing crimes in the United States than any other racial demographic, which is very different from what he said. All that indicates is that the so-called criminal justice system in the United States is primarily only effective in the selective investigation, prosecution, and conviction of African Americans and other so-called minorities, as opposed to investigating, prosecuting, and convicting white perpetrators. The statistics that he's citing are actually an evidence arguing racial bias in policing, in prosecution, and in trials. It's not an evidence of greater criminality along racial demographic lines, no. Rather, it's only the assignment of criminality that falls along racial lines. I mean, more than half of all violent crimes in the United States go unsolved, overwhelmingly the case in certain types of violent crimes. So we're not talking actually about a criminal justice system that works, that's actually effective, that's actually efficient, that actually does its job. What we have is a criminal justice system that disproportionately seems to only quote-unquote work when the perpetrators are not white. African-American victims of homicide, by the way, make up most of the victims of homicide cases that go unsolved, whereas most homicide cases in which the victim is white, those get solved. In other words, crimes against white people are more likely to get solved than crimes against African-American people or any other so-called minority group, a member of the global majority. And they're even more likely to get solved when the perpetrator of the crime happens to be African-American. So in other words, if you're a white victim, you're more likely to get justice, and if you're a white perpetrator, you're more likely to escape justice. That's the system, and that's all that is evidenced by what he's saying. So when you look at the number of unsolved crimes, it's not unreasonable to assume that the, say, 60% or so of violent crimes in America that never get solved, that those are very possibly crimes committed by white people against African-American people or against other so-called minority groups. So rather than saying blacks commit more crimes than anyone else in America, it would be more honest to say that no one who commits a crime in America is more likely to be punished for that crime than an African-American. And in fact, it's also more likely for an African-American person to be wrongfully convicted of a crime of which they are accused. And it's more likely for them to even be punished for that, even when they have been proven innocent. And you can look at the case right now of Marcellus Williams. So the statistics that he's citing actually only substantiate the belief that the so-called criminal justice system in the United States is a major component of what you can call a systematic domestic ethnic cleansing program in America, being carried out against African Americans and other members of the global majority. That's all that is evidenced by the statistics that he's citing. And this, in fact, demonstrates a vastly greater degree of criminality than anything that he mentioned. And I would go further to say that this speaker himself, with the statistics that he's mentioning and the interpretation that he's putting on those statistics, that he himself occupies a propaganda role in that ethnic cleansing system, for which, in my opinion, he could and should be prosecuted under international law.
So again, I'm not saying he has everything right. I think there are a couple of things wrong, but I think the gist of what he's saying is a nice way for us to hear and have this dialogue in a way that you won't hear on regular media. And then you, being a civil rights lawyer specifically, I'm very curious at your take on what you just heard.
Well, I'm very familiar with how the American legal system, I don't call it the American justice system. I think that's a misnomer. The American legal system certainly is part of the American enterprise. And depending upon what you think the American enterprise is striving to achieve, you will agree more or less with what he's saying. When it comes to the original speaker, though, let's start with that. The original speaker makes the argument that Black folks are more criminal than other groups. Or I think he was probably leading into the argument that Black folks kill more Black folks than any other group. And why are you all complaining about all of these police shootings when you're killing yourselves? It's a common form of propaganda. It is one of those other effective ways to defame an entire group. And it is certainly a political part of the political effort to marginalize, depower, prevent Black people from acquiring power, do all these types of things to Black people. Or you don't have to say Black people, just anybody who is not a member of the group or the person who is speaking. So on that front, I think he made some good arguments with respect to how the criminal justice system is stacked against African Americans in some respects. But there's a missing link to the argument. The American legal system is designed so that it protects people who are wealthy from people who are not. People who are wealthy have a different experience with American law and law enforcement than people who are not. People who are not wealthy, they are subject to more laws being enforced against them than people who are wealthy. People who are wealthy get the benefits, and these are significant benefits. If you ever have to interact with the American legal system, they get the benefit of being able to afford extremely skilled attorneys. They do not have to rely on overworked, overburdened, very good, but overworked and overburdened public defenders. They can get one lawyer to focus on their case, a team of lawyers to focus on their case, figure out every angle, get every piece of evidence, fight that case as well as a dollar will allow you to fight it. And they have money to spend on their defense. But if you're really wealthy, you don't even get charged. Because what happens is the people who become the leaders of the government institutions, the mayors, the governors, the people who select the law enforcement community in their states and cities, those folks are folks you know personally. Those are folks you did fundraisers for. Those are folks that you can call someone within these organizations and say, hey, this just happened. I need your help. And I'm not saying that all of these institutions are corrupt. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that if you got some money, you can make a phone call. And if you make a phone call that's timely placed to the right person, things might not unfold the same way as if you didn't have that kind of connection, if you hadn't written that $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 check to the nonprofit that is your mayor's favorite nonprofit, or if you hadn't donated the maximum amount of money to everybody up and down the slate for a particular party or for both parties. A lot of rich people donate money to everybody, and they don't care who wins as long as they maintain access. So when you don't have the resources to play this game the way wealthy, powerful, and prestigious people play it, you are subjected to the full brunt of it. And so what is happening in the American legal system is you get more brothers and sisters who are subjected to the full brunt of it. They don't have the resources to fight back the way that their upper class peers have. And that is a big part of the disparities that we see. But make no mistake about it. The American legal system is led by a certain type of American more than it's led by any other type of American, and that is the white male. It is the middle upper class white male and upper class white male. These white males come from families that have the resources to send their children to law school, oftentimes second, third generation lawyers. It takes some political maneuvering to become a prestigious judge at most levels. And they have connections with other powerful people that enable them to become judges. And they have certain ideologies, whether they realize it or not, that they promulgate because they have discretion and they see the people in their courtroom based upon how they live their lives and their culture and their beliefs. So when you have such a predominant percentage of people who are controlling the American legal system, at least in the courtrooms, who are white males, you should expect this system to indicate that it is going to reflect their biases. And so when they see things that they, like the rest of us, have been influenced by our American culture, they're going to make presumptions and they're going to fear things in ways that they wouldn't if they knew better. So part of it is our leaders in the American judicial system kind of seeing Black folks differently than they see white folks at every level of the socioeconomic spectrum. But then there's one final component. American lawyers have to deal with precedent. And what that means is if something was done in the past, a judge is supposed to, if it was done by a higher court, do the same thing when the same facts come across his desk in a trial court. So the judge is supposed to follow what judges in the past have done. Now, when you think about that, it's difficult to imagine getting ahead as an African American, because built into the American judicial precedential history is so much racism, so much anti-African sentiment, that it is impossible for anybody who has good legal training and good common sense to believe that all of that can be eradicated. Not that it has been eradicated, but that it's possible to eradicate it without undoing the entire history of American law. So if you're not going to start from scratch and start from the very beginning, no precedent, and just start from core moral principles based upon where we are today, you are accepting the fact that there is going to be some anti-African sentiment built into the laws that are going to give Africans a slight disadvantage. Now, this is a meta-level thinking about the American legal system, of course, but it is still a good point to make in addition to the other 2 points. So what you have is you have a disparity in resources to fight the American legal system when it comes to get you, a disparity when it comes to how the judges perceive you. They perceive you as different from your white peers in the same socioeconomic groups. And you have a disparity when it comes to how the history of the law is going to give you advantage or disadvantage comparative to your peers. So we're working against all of these things simultaneously. And to me, I think it is an impressive feat that so many of us are not in prison, that so many of us did not go to jail. I think that's an impressive feat, given all of the disadvantages that we face when it comes to the American legal system.
And when we speak of Black on Black crime, what pops in our head are Black on Black murders. Like, let's be honest about that context, right? And so when you say it's a feat, here's the other part of it, Ed. 99.9% of African Americans will never be involved in a murder. We don't have that context because the political narrative narrows it down to, oh, look at how many murders are committed, but you're not recognizing you're talking about less than 1% of the population, if you will, or even as he pointed out, so many violent crimes go unsolved, but even of those that are solved, murderers are the smallest group of all the different reasons you would be in prison. It is the smallest group because the majority of people will never, one, commit murder, right? And then the other thing is the context of this, and I'll go to another cut. The other context is I have a listener in Canada that'll call me from time to time, and we were talking about this Black on Black crime issue, and she's up in Toronto, I think Toronto, Canada. And I said to her one time, I says, why have you even heard of Chicago? I was asking her to give her a context. She was talking about all the murders that happened in Chicago. And I says, the reason you've heard it in your country, above us, is because it's propaganda for you to wonder what's going on with the Black community. I live in Atlanta and it's nothing like Chicago. And I live in an all Black neighborhood and it's nothing like Chicago. And then if you get specific to FBI crime data, Chicago isn't what we think it is based on the narrative. There are hot spots, which I know you understand, in which a lot of murders take place. And then that context gets driven out as if Chicago is this entirely dangerous place. But then the propaganda is used outside of the United States, and Chicago is highlighted to have somebody like herself think that this is what's happening in all Black neighborhoods. What happens around the world if you have high density of population and lower job opportunities outside of governments that have a religious aspect to them. All around the world, you see murders go up. It happened during the pandemic. There was a 30% increase, the biggest jump we ever seen after the pandemic in all districts across the country, a 30% increase in murder. We had never seen that type of jump since the murder rate had been lowering for the last 40 years. That 30% increase happened in all districts, no matter which political party was in the lead, because it shows what happens consistently. It is an economic issue, but we have falsely placed race on crime because of political narratives. Do we have neighborhoods in which there are high crimes? That's all it should be called, but it should not be put towards the entire community as if we all have a problem that's happening in this one neighborhood, because I've lived in Black neighborhoods in my entire life and I haven't had to be concerned with any of those things because of where I choose to live, and that's the majority of Black neighborhoods. Go ahead, brother.
The poorer I was in my lifetime, the more violence I was near. The poorer I was, the more violence I was near. So when I was a younger man growing up in Long Beach and Compton, California, and what was almost certainly the lowest 20% when it comes to household incomes in the United States at the time, I saw and was exposed to a lot more violence. But I have now lived in all the major classes in the United States. Born into what you would call, most people would call either lower class or working class. I'm not sure how it's defined nowadays. Certainly rose up the ranks socioeconomically to get into the middle class, largely due through education, going to the Air Force Academy, getting a good job, steady job, getting into the funnel for the American opportunities. And then entrepreneurship and lawyering puts me into the upper class. So having experienced all of those classes, I can tell you without a doubt that when I was poorer, there was more violence close to me. But as I have gotten wealthier, it's hard to find it. It's just hard to find it. And I'm not exposed to it unless I go to it. So it's not near my home. I don't have people breaking in. There aren't gunshots. The crime rate in my zip code is very, very low. And it has a lot to do with the average household income in the zip code. So that's something you are directly on point on when it comes to the socioeconomics. The socioeconomics is the thing. Here's the thing. Due to hundreds of years of something that is the opposite of fair play, when it comes to our bloodlines, a greater percentage of us have not yet gotten into the middle class, into the upper class. That's what's happening. A greater percentage of us who could have gotten into the middle class and the upper class have not gotten into the middle class and the upper class because our headwinds, our bloodlines' headwinds have been so intense for so long. And what else would one expect? Any group faced with these kind of headwinds is going to get there a little bit more slowly. That's all we're seeing.
That's all we're seeing.
That's all we're seeing. And the thing is that when you talk about, well, what's the solution? The solution is to either get better at beating back these headwinds or being excellent in spite of these headwinds, or to get rid of the headwinds. To get rid of the headwinds, you in America need to have wealth and power, because here the game is a game that oligarchs play. If you got a lot of money, then you can change something within your lifetime. If you don't have a lot of money, you're in for a slow road.
And that's not associated with race. And so that's why I wanted to have that dialogue, because we've accepted the dialogue as a racial one. And it's simply everything that you just laid out for one. And then let's add one more context, because even being poor, growing up in the South without density of population, I still didn't experience the dangers that you experienced over on the West Coast when I learned about what was happening through NWA on your side of the country. I had to learn about it because that was not my experience in a three-stop like all black town. Poor
That's right.
at that. But again, all of those things were culminated. That's why San Bernardino, California, which is all Hispanic, has a high murder rate based on those specific conditions. All of the high murder rate areas have the same conditions based on density of population and the actual job availability. And that applies even on the south side of Boston, that is mostly white people who are also having a higher murder rate than the rest of Boston, if you will. It is not a racial one. It is an economic and proximity based on opportunity. And that's
That's
something that
exactly right.
we have to understand so that we don't continue to say these things to our children. Here's another example of a myth I would like to kill during this show. And it's just a little quick context from this Shannon Sharpe show with Godfrey, the comedian. So I want to play this cut and give you some less dialogue through these through these conversations.
Can I tell you a story? Can I tell you a story?
Sure, I'd love to hear
Okay,
it.
there was a guy I knew who was a big time drug dealer pushing mad weight. He was one of the biggest in New York City. And he was telling us, me and my boy and shit, Artie Fuqua, he was telling us, you know, I ain't afraid of shit. I ain't afraid of nothing. He goes, but I went to China to make this deal with the mafia over there, the triads and shit.
Yeah.
And he goes, I'm talking to these dudes. And he goes, I ain't never been afraid of shit. But when I got into their like headquarters,
You in there, yeah.
they were so organized. It was scaring the shit out of me. They were so calm and so organized. They were sharp. And the guy, he's talking to the head dude, and he goes, you know, the one thing about black people, he says, you guys are, you're the trendsetters. Everybody copy black people. You're so creative. Your music, your style, everybody like black people. We're jealous of you. But the one thing you don't have is unity. Very easy to break you up. Wow. And this is in the drug game. He says, we don't
He ain't lie, though.
He says, we can't even organize crime. Wow. We can't even organize crime.
So you hear Shannon Sharpe say, he didn't lie though. And I wanted to get into the psychology of why we so readily agree with the context that we just heard. Now, I'll give you more context. So again, we're assuming this story is true because it's his friend, right? His relative experience. And so he's talking to a triad leader, which is a Chinese mafia group, if you will, just to give more context. But as that conversation is said, if I lined up that same triad leader with a Japanese Yakuza mafia leader, they would have no unity whatsoever. They would be at each other's throats in most contexts. But again, going back to the beginning of the show, how we've accepted this construct as an indictment to our community from a psychological standpoint, we will readily line up with that story because to that triad leader, the construct of race makes him say black people have no unity because black and white are racial constructs. All other things that we make the mistake of comparing to are ethnic groups and tribal things that all groups have differences that they will go back and forth with. And you've never seen at no point in history, if you will, all white people come together, all Asians come together, using that specific example. Again, Japanese and Yakuza and triad will be at each other's throats because in the context that triad leader is using, it would be as if Taiwan and China would be cool with each other. But that's not the context of what humans do, nor have we ever seen that context. But that is an indictment of how we attempt to say our unity should be, because this construct, not knowing our actual tribe and history due to the American experience, we accept it as an indictment on our race as if it is the equivalent of an ethnic group or a group who knows their history. That has to be broken down so that we don't accept these false constructs and have a Shannon Sharpe readily say, yeah, that's what we do. No, that's not what we do. Not at all. We are no different than any other group who has something in common and decide we're going to do this together. And sometimes you will be up against those who are like you. I highlight this one last thing and I'll let you jump in, Ed. But in the event of even how this country, because again, we've accepted the construct of the white race, but there was no point in the building of this country that the British were not at the French and the British were not at the Americans. And at one point, the British, who readily took part in the enslavement trade, if you will, they actually end up being America's arch enemy to the continuation of the enslavement trade based on their political interests between the countries of still trying to control their former colony. So I use that example to say not even all white people were on the same page for what happened in this country, because the construct has been used from a psychological standpoint and we receive it as if it's similar to all of those examples, and we're actually acting like every other group and don't realize it.
I hate that unity argument a lot, man. I tell you, what they're really arguing, I think, is I hear two things: that Black culture sucks is one part of the gist of that argument. Your culture sucks, and then the other part of it is you are disloyal to one another. And those are your problems. You have bad culture when it comes to these economic competitions, and you're disloyal to one another. That is a passive aggressive insult on all Black Americans, all African Americans. And when a brother like Shannon Sharp says he ain't lying, though, you know, I don't want to jump down his throat, but I do want to peel it back. I want to say, look, brother, you know, he ain't lying. Well, what is he telling the truth about?
Exactly.
So if he's telling the truth that we're not loyal to one another, or that our culture sucks, or as you might call it, we're not unified, in what ways do you believe we are less unified than we would be if we were the ones who said that all other groups were 3/5 of a human being in the 17th century, 18th century? If we were the ones who started a game like that, they say you all are 3/5, you have 3/5 of what we have, where would we be? Would we be less or more unified? And when you get into these kind of conversations, what you quickly find out is that these brothers have bought into that narrative. And it oftentimes is a wealthier brother who wants to believe that he, on his own steam, without much help from anyone else, figured out the game. He got all the money, and that everybody who's struggling to get the money is just not getting it because they didn't work hard enough, or they weren't as smart as he is, or they didn't have the gifts and talents that God blessed him with. And he wants to say, it's me that got me to where I am. And he doesn't want to admit that there are systemic issues or systemic problems that are preventing other equally talented brothers, maybe more talented brothers, from rising up the socioeconomic ranks. So he has something to protect when he says he's not lying, because what he's saying is that Black folks aren't supporting my money-making efforts as much as they should, or Black folks aren't working together to make more money as much as we should. But there's a whole bunch of things that we are working together doing pretty well, if you ask me. We are doing a pretty good job of making sure that every generation, we steadily put a couple of more young brothers and sisters through college, put a couple of more brothers and sisters into career fields that are enabling them to live fulfilling lives if they're not going to college. We're saving money across generations. We're figuring out this game of capitalism that's being played in the United States, and we're figuring it out as fast as any other group that you would expect to figure it out, who has suffered through what we've suffered through, if not faster. So when I look at it from a broader perspective, I think we are nothing but the epitome of unity, because we are making progress in spite of, like I said earlier, headwinds that the world has not seen in a society this large in the modern era. So because of that, when you accept the we're not unified argument, what you're in essence saying is that the brothers and sisters who didn't make a lot of money, there must be something wrong with them because I'm the special one because I made money. They must not be special, or it must be something about the culture. No, that's not it at all. When you look at the big picture, the reason why a brother like Shannon Sharp exists, the reason why he gets to do what he's getting to do, is because we have had generations and generations of unified progress. And that is something that's lost when brothers want to fall into that really quick, bad, in my opinion, argument that shakes a finger at Black folks about us not being unified. I'm just going to give you one more point. So I'm a member of a fraternity that some people know about, some don't. It's called the Boule, also Sigma Pi Phi. When we have these kind of conversations internally, we think we are extremely unified. We talk about politics. We talk about business. We lock arms. We work together on deals. We help one another progress through our various careers. We give one another advice. We're support systems. And it's not something that's unique to our group. It's just a feature of our group. And this is happening among all African Americans. And how do you know? If we weren't supporting one another like this, if we weren't coming together when we needed to fight a political battle at a local level, which is where we can make a difference, if we weren't doing all of that, we would be lost in America by now. We would have been completely and totally ruined in America by now, but for our centuries of unity. So I don't like that argument, and I think it's a passive aggressive way of insulting all Black people.
Absolutely. And you speak to those facts. And I represent the Mental Dialogue Community Club, which is, if you will, the layman version to what you do in a very organic way. And I always say, for people that step inside of that barbershop that coffee shop with us once a month, if you have a negative stereotype about our community, it all dies here, because we do all the opposite of what you think we don't do in this room, and have been doing it for 10 years as a business, and 15 plus years before we turned it into a business, if you will. And so we live out the opposite of these false narratives. And that is the reality. As you said, there are many examples like yourself, the community club being another. Here's another myth that I would like to address, because you talked about wealth and power, and that being the difference maker when we're talking about the legal system. I want to highlight this, what you're about to hear. I'm going to lead and say everything you hear is false, in my opinion, but I'll be curious at your thoughts after I give some more context. But let me play this cut. This is from the Nick Cannon show, a brother he had on there.
On into 2025 and the country under new leadership, is there a direction that the Black community should be focused?
We have tried everything in our 400-year sojourn but one thing, and that's unity. In order for us to get freedom, justice, and equality, we need to do what other ethnic groups have done. We are scared of the word separation. And when I say separation, that don't mean separating from others with the intent of hating them. I'm talking about separating with others, of where we pool our resources together and we begin to do for ourselves what we've begged others to do for us. And we got to stop begging for a Democratic Party or a Republican Party to do for us what we could unite and do for ourselves. We have a $1.7 trillion spending power, and the dollar don't circulate for 6 hours in the Black community before it's gone. So we need to create a Black economy, which we can handle all of our business. And until we do that, dear brother, no other group will respect us.
If you haven't heard it, if you're watching this or see this later, is absolutely wrong. I'm leading, not just giving my opinion. I'm gonna break down how it is absolutely wrong, but I wanted to lead with that, because I would say, even when I started Mental Dialogue, I was have to admit this. I wrote my book and I highlighted this, that the first few years of the Mental Dialogue, everything he just said, I would have accepted as completely right, based on the things that I understood, the lack of research when it came to understanding, if you will, the 1.7 trillion spending, quote unquote, power that he speaks to, and that historically we had never had unity and we were begging for right. Like, that is the narrative. I want to say, not only is it absolutely wrong, but it is a complete disservice to the historical context of what our ancestors' aim has been since stepping foot on this continent. It is a complete disservice, because a context that is often said that this country was founded by its founding fathers without us in mind. While that being true, as you highlighted, Ed, when the founding fathers were putting the Constitution together and putting in legal rights, we were not considered, if you will. And then along the way, 3/5, for the vote, if you will. What people don't understand, and was unfair to our ancestors, is this: while we were not considered in the beginning, our ancestors did not beg. They actually put in efforts so that those laws would apply. And what I always highlight that's lost on the public school system when it comes to understanding the civil rights period, the number one thing that they were looking for during that time was equal protection of the law. We've learned it in the narrative of integration and being able to go to school with, our fellow white people, if you will. That's the context that we learn the civil rights history. But we lose the context of equal protection was the thing that they wanted first and foremost, because while we had, if you will, some of our African Americans already, despite the headwinds that you keep speaking to, Ed, that already had some success. We now go back and learn the histories of the Tulsa Oklahomas, the Rosewoods, the Winston-Salem Black enclaves that we, now some can go learn that history, if you will. But what was happening, we now look back on that history, and brothers that, again, I'm not indicting that particular brother, but he's understood a narrative that is absolutely unfair. Like the one thing that get added to that context is, we'll say, due to integration, we actually lost our businesses because we began or thought that the white man's ice was colder. That's a narrative that is said today, which is a complete unfair narrative to the fact that those Black enclaves were typically destroyed many a ways, whether by highway, whether by lake being pushed over, or actual destruction as of Rosewood and Tulsa, that we now know those histories. It never included our African-American ancestors building themselves up in those enclaves, and then integration happens and they say, oh, I'm going to leave this business that I'm successful in and start doing business over here. That has never happened. That has never been what our ancestors have done. But when we put it in a nice bow and highlight that we've never had unity, that we actually begged for our rights, when we put it in that context, it does a real disservice for why you and I, as I always like to highlight, can be on YouTube right now discussing this history, putting the correct context on it, is because our ancestors said, while we was not considered in the beginning, you will recognize us for our lineage so they won't suffer through what we suffered through. That's the efforts, and comments like his do a disservice to our ancestors. Your thoughts?
So you would have heard an argument like he made come directly out of the mouth of our dear departed brother Malcolm X. You would have heard an argument like he made coming out of the mouth of Marcus Garvey. You would have heard counter arguments coming out of the mouths of Martin Luther King Jr. And you would have heard counter arguments coming out of the mouths of folks like even Thurgood Marshall, who took a different approach than Martin Luther King Jr. Indeed, Thurgood Marshall didn't think all the marching was going to get it done. He was convinced that you had to make change through one of the institutions that actually runs America, which is the judicial branch. But when I think about how to synthesize those two sides, what I'll say, the Malcolm X v. Martin Luther King debate, or the Garvey v. Martin Luther King debate.
Garvey Du Bois.
Right. Well, Du Bois is not, no, he and Du Bois weren't at odds as much as people say.
Okay.
But when I think about this, that reminds me of something I read in a book that Juan Williams wrote. He wrote a really good biography of Thurgood Marshall.
Okay.
He explains the reason why Thurgood Marshall was dead set on desegregating Black Americans. One of the things that bothered Thurgood Marshall when he would talk to young Black Americans, particularly young Black American boys, is when he would reach them in their, grade school, middle school years, he would ask them what they want to do, what they want to be when they grew up. You know what they would say? They would say, I want to be the best porter. I want to be the best doorman. I want to be the best mail carrier. And the reason why he believed that they were thinking like this is because of segregation, which meant economic isolation. You weren't being allowed to make money off of other groups. It's a form of isolationism. Cut you off from the broader economic system, cut you off from the global economic system, which limits your overall potential economically. Because if you got the best business in the world and you can't trade with anybody outside of your block, no one's ever going to know it, and you're not going to profit. You're not going to scale. You're not going to become Tesla. But if you have access to all the capital, if you have access to all the customers, and you can compete on the merit, and you got the best product, well, you're supposed to become a multi-billionaire. So what Thurgood Marshall thought is that the segregation combined with this kind of cultural attack, this defamation against Black people, was causing generations of Black folks to limit themselves by thinking to themselves they cannot become what the white folks become. But there was a reason why they were thinking this, is because they had been cut off from the economic systems by being isolated through segregation. So he wanted to desegregate. And he believed that by desegregating, Black businesses, Black professionals would be in a better position to compete on their merit. Although he knew that it would take some time before it would be a fair fight. You got to start the process somewhere. You got to actually get us in the arena. And then over time, because we are so excellent, because we are so unified, we will begin to slowly catch up with respect to our overall performance with other groups who have had the advantage of being able to have access to capital, the advantage of not having laws that suppress and oppress them for centuries. We would be able to catch up with them relatively quickly, and that has been the case. So when I was thinking through that passage and I was thinking about Thurgood Marshall, I was thinking, what would Thurgood Marshall say? What Thurgood Marshall would say is that you have to put yourself in the competition against the world's best. And you need policies that get you in a position where your business can compete against the world's best. You also need access to capital. And that's the part of the brother's argument that I think has some weight that we need to consider. What we do with respect to how we manage our capital as a group could use some improvement. But how we support one another when we have an enterprise, I don't know if there's much room for improvement there. So when we're talking about unification, there are plenty of Black folks who support Black businesses. Indeed, if it's a good business, you're going to get support, you're going to thrive. But the capital that you need to scale, to turn your ideas into reality, to make your great business model as competitive as it ought to be, the capital you might not have access to due to the fact that, like most people, when you're looking for capital at the initial stages of a business's growth, you're looking to friends and family. And if you are not born into a middle or upper class family, your access to capital is different than if you are. So there are plenty more mediocre to excellent white entrepreneurs who have access to capital than there are African Americans who have access to capital. And it has nothing to do with the merit, nothing to do with the quality of the ideas. It has a lot to do with how wealthy their friends and family are, which has a lot to do with how the competition has played out in the past couple hundred years. So when I hear brothers like that making that kind of argument, I want to agree with them about 10%, and then 90% I want to have a conversation about why they're wrong to think about Black folks that way. The 10% is, yes, we can use and reuse our capital better so that we can get a better return. And to the extent that we're not marshaling our resources as profitably as possible, there's room for improvement. But are we unified with respect to how much we support one another? Yes. Do we support one another when we have the opportunities because we have a little power or wealth in the corporate sector? Yes. Do we support one another's businesses? Yes. Do we buy Black? Yes. The thing is that we need to be in a position where we can be more supportive because we have more money, which is part of the capitalism that we're dealing with, the competition. As we accumulate more money, we will have more friends and family that will enable us to launch these startups in the same ways that our white peers launch them. So I think that brother is falling for the okie doke only in one respect. When he makes the argument that we are not supporting one another as much as we should, I think he's dead wrong. When he makes the argument, however, if you glean this from his argument, that we could do a little bit better with respect to managing our capital, I think he's right. But we are not awful at it. And I would not ever give us that label that we're awful at it. If we were awful at it, we wouldn't have as many thriving Black businesses and Black professionals as we have today. That is a marker that we're doing excellently. And I think I always push back when I hear that argument come out of brothers.
No, absolutely. And let me give some context because I'm a numbers guy. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know I said we might extend. I'm not going to extend just a few more minutes here. But I want to give even more context because of how those numbers are misused. And I used to misuse this number, if you will. So the 1.7 trillion, I just want to give context. So there's a myth that we are the biggest consumers in America that I used to believe until I actually looked up the numbers, if you will. So the C League Center here in Georgia puts out the consumer index number, and we call it consumer power, if you will, but we're not the biggest consumers. We're sitting at 1.6 billion, if you will. Hispanics, who are slightly higher than us in population, they spend 1.9 trillion each year, if you will. And white America spends 12.5 trillion each year. And Asians are actually the biggest consumers based on their population base of being only 6.3% of this population. They actually spend 1.3 billion each year. Here's the other context that's lost on looking at that number from the C League Center each year. It is used to push consumerism. And so we mistakenly will say, our 1.7 trillion is bigger than all these other countries' GDP. GDP is a production number. They're completely lost in context. And here's the last part on all of those numbers. All of those numbers are congruent with population size, the numbers that I just laid out. And what it ends up being for every average American, 70 to 80% of that spending is on needs, and 20 to 30% can be considered discretionary based on how you live and how you can live. And so while there's another study by the Warfield Institute that highlights that for the most part, even poor people who have a psychological concept of keeping up with the Joneses, we've seen that in a lot of our communities, but they still only have so very little discretionary money to actually do that with based on their needs. So the majority of that money, as big as that number sounds, is actually spent on what people need, and we should never even use that number as an indictment on us. But I remember when I first heard it back years ago when it was 1.3 trillion, I actually believed we spent more than anyone else because I had done no research, because I am so used to indicting our community as if we're acting different or worse than all others. But the facts play out that in this sense, we're doing nothing no different than what all of America does. I have a friend who says USA stands for United States of Advertisement, right? We have the number one capitalistic economy in the world, and these numbers are played out to push consumerism. And I'm not, to your point, Ed, absolutely, let's be smarter with what we have. But to think that we're doing something different when the facts play out that we are not, we should no longer assume and believe but the things that we are the biggest consumers in the country, when in fact we sit right where our population sits. We're not the biggest consumers. Asians actually are based on their population. And again, that's not an indictment on them. That's the fact that, generally speaking, that group has more money than white America. So they spend more. It's simply that. But we treat it as an indictment on us. Those are the conversations of why I wanted to do this today. Your thoughts, King?
I think it's just another form of defamation on all of the African American people. It's defamation. And this is a steady theme, downplaying the successes of the African living in America, defaming the African culture when it comes to these kind of economic competitions, convincing as many people as you can that Africans are inferior in some meaningful and measurable way. It's all part of this propaganda, this defamation. And that's just one of the things that we have to deal with. It's just one part of the headwinds here in the United States. And who are we to blame a brother for falling victim to it? He gets pummeled with it. He gets pummeled with it in his Hollywood movies. If he gets a little money and he doesn't want to attribute any of his success to the communities that raised him, to the family that taught him whatever he needed to know to get in a position to become what he became. If he wants to take most of the credit for himself, what is that brother going to do? He's going to say it's the culture's fault, right? So the thing is that when you have that kind of narrative, you got to have some sympathy for brothers who fall for the okie doke, because it's not easy to see through it. And so this brother here is telling us that we don't support one another enough. We are where we are because we are not unified. My narrative is that is inconsistent with my reading of history and my reading of economics, and I think with your reading of economics and history. We are where we are supposed to be because we are showing how good we can be in spite of these headwinds. When you were making the point earlier about how we kind of embrace these narratives, think about how good we have to be to ignore the narratives, considering how prevalent they are. Think about how good we have to be, how smart we have to be to see the news every night and say, that's not us, that's not me. But damn, the question that you always ask is, who is benefiting from this defamation? Who's getting richer, more powerful, and more prestigious based on defaming the African American? And it shouldn't take you too long to figure out who that is. It's not your fellow African Americans for sure. So we're not benefiting from it. Guess what? We don't own these networks that publish all of this information. We don't own the movie studios that publish all this information. And even those of us who do own some of it, we still have to think about this. In order for them to be in a position where they can push all this type of stuff on us, they got to make some agreements. They got to agree to be and to think and to act in the world in a certain kind of way, or they lose their billion, they lose their 100 million. They are taken out of that status level. So they have to maintain for the true group that is benefiting from the defamation. So what is that group trying to accomplish? Well, the more that it can convince the world, including the African Americans, that we are in some way not united, some way inferior, that we don't move the same way that our Jewish brothers and sisters move, or our Chinese brothers and sisters move, or any other group that has had some very good success since the civil rights movement in the 20th century, or some very good success since the Civil War. Any group that has had more success per generation than us, people want to say we're not moving in America as well as they are. But I can tell you, we're moving just fine in America. And we had to start moving about a century, 150 years sooner than all these other groups that we're often compared to in America. So we have a much bigger problem intergenerationally that we're overcoming. And a lot of it has to do with the defamation. So in addition to everybody around us having these lowered opinions of us due to the propaganda that they're exposed to, we have also absorbed. And we have a lowered opinion of ourselves. But where you often find the folks who are going to promulgate those types of arguments, they tend to be folks who have gotten themselves in a position in a corporation, kind of gotten to the point where the people who have sponsored them, the people who have helped them move up the ranks, they've had to kind of, I don't want to say kowtow to them, but they had to ingratiate themselves to them. They had to persuade them that they were of a similar mindset in order to rise up the ranks. Because you weren't going to get to the VP level. You weren't going to get to the C-suite talking like you're some type of Malcolm X activist. You aren't going to make it that far. So brothers who have that kind of success in corporate world, dealing with a lot of corporations that are not owned by Black people, and that's how they make their money, they have already been selected for the way they see the world. And that is in part one of the reasons why they were so successful, because these institutions that want to push this narrative selected them because they were willing to embrace it and promulgate it themselves. And I'm not getting mad at brothers for doing that.
Nope, not at all.
You go make your money as best you can in America. Make your money.
Let me say this to highlight what you're saying right now, because here's the reality. If anything we've said, for anybody watch this, that if we've made sense of some of the myths, that's what I wanted to do with this show, right? Do we have to do better? We are not only are we doing just fine, but to your point, Ed, the grace has to go both ways. The grace on not accepting this defamation that is propagated right on our people and thinking that way. But to your point, the grace for those who succeed, because historically it was in the context of, you're not like the other Black people, right? I don't think we've become diverse to the point where now I don't think that's the experience that people are hearing specifically to get to the C-suite, as you just mentioned, or whatever. But it's still, as you said, some level of kowtowing. Here's the beauty of all ethnic groups and all races. All groups have all of that going on.
That's right.
And I am just wanting us to understand, this is mental dialogue, and get into the psychology of understanding that we're acting no different, whether you're on whatever end of the economic spectrum. If you had privilege to be inside of a Jewish community or inside of a Chinese, I'm just using them as examples. One of my most watched shows on mental dialogue, top 5, was what can we learn from Chinese Americans? And I had on a Chinese American who had immigrated here illegally and now is a big time restaurant owners of restaurants all throughout the country. And so in that dialogue, he was saying, I don't know why people assume that my process for who I trust is any different than it is for you as a Black person. I can't trust every Chinese American. I find my circle, narrow down my circle, weed away those who do me wrong in my own group. And when I get a tight circle, I was able to elevate. That's what every group does. And we've somehow accepted the narrative that we don't do that. And the reality is we've absolutely done the same things to be successful, which is what you've continued to repeat throughout this show. Out of respect for your time, I'm going to play one last short cut and we'll close out with this cut that is as a reminder. And the biggest reason I wanted to do this show is for people to, if you feel like you have a different perspective on the narratives, it is imperative that you do not repeat these negative narratives to the next generation, because we raise a group of children who believe these false narratives, and it ends up being just as limiting as Thurgood Marshall, using your example, Ed, on what he saw those young people aspire to. They were only aspiring to a certain level. That's the reality of these narratives being accepted by us. And to your point, there are those who are benefiting off that narrative. That's why it's pushed. But we do not have to accept them, not because we don't want to accept them, but our reality is we're not that propaganda at all. There's nothing that backs up that propaganda when you actually do the research. So I'll play this last cut and get your final thought. But thank you for an amazing show, brother. But this is just a great way to close out today's show.
Every single Black person that you see is a walking miracle. You're looking at a miracle right now, and so am I. Because for each generation of people that had to survive, all the things that they had to survive that made it possible for us to even be born. We are a miraculous people, each and every one of us. So if I was an ancestor, I would remind that baby first, if they didn't already know, your whole existence is a miracle. You have this unique set of capabilities, mind, physical form, all these things. You have this one life right here. Don't waste it. Don't waste it thinking about what other people are perceiving you to be. Just like really get in here, acknowledge and accept that you are a miraculous human being, and you deserve to go live out your potential.
This is our new format, y'all. I will do a couple of, just for the record, for those who know about the Blog Talk Radio, I may do 1 or 2 more shows that way, but this will be our new format. We will pop up. We may not be every Saturday, just to give that context. But Attorney Ed Hopkins, you have been amazing. Again, helping me break down the psychology of we got to do better. I think we're doing just fine, and I think this cut highlights it. I'll give you the final thought for today's discussion. Thank you, King, for being with me this morning.
Her argument that each one of us is a miracle is something that we all need to leave this conversation thinking and teaching to everybody we meet, because that's exactly how I see myself and how I see every other African American, every other African whose bloodline has been here for a few centuries. You are a miracle. And that, in my mind, gets 3 things done at the same time. You are acknowledging our ancestors. Just imagine, just if you can, even if you haven't read all the history books, just imagine how brilliant, how excellent they had to have been to survive what they survived for centuries. Just imagine it. Just imagine how strong, and it wasn't just physical strength, it was religious, emotional, social strength to endure what happened to the African during the first couple of 100 years of our time here in the United States or America. So just imagine that for a moment. It's acknowledging that when you talk about miracles. You're also acknowledging what they dreamed of. They had dreams of us. Every generation dreamed that their child was going to do better than they were doing, that their child was going to have an opportunity to experience freedom, liberty, to flourish. That's kept them going. Their faith in the possibility, the probability that their child, their blood, would have the opportunity to live the life that they dreamed about. That's part of the miracle, because the prayer that our ancestors made was answered. It was answered. We are proof of it. And so when you think about it in those terms, even if you're not religious, whatever your definition of miracle is, if you're a scientist, a miracle would be something that is as close to impossible that you cannot really explain why it happened. It shouldn't have happened. This is getting pretty close. Why are we still here thriving the way we are in spite of all of that? In spite of all of that. And when you think of it in those terms, if you don't want to use religious terms, I don't see how you can classify it as anything other than a miraculous path here. And we are each a representative of a miraculous bloodlines that have come to America and figured out a way to flourish in spite of it. So I love her argument, and that's the thought I'm going to leave with today. I don't buy any of these narratives that we are lesser, that we are inferior, that we are disloyal to one another. I don't buy any of the narratives that we're not unified, that we're not doing as well as we should. All of that, to me, is fallacious. What is true is that we represent what I consider to be the most beautiful experience of struggle, successful struggle that the world has ever seen. And we are in the embodiment of what a group can be if you are excellent and you fight with one another to maintain and to grow in the worst environment that you could possibly imagine.
Love it. Thank you. If you're a first-time watcher of the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, highly encourage you to pick up Re-Education of the Negro. It is commentaries to challenge these conversations and make you think differently so that we can improve. As we always say, you can't act right if you don't think right. So hope y'all like Mental Dialogue 2.0, the upgrade to the live YouTube, Facebook show. And so we'll see y'all. We'll be popping up. We'll try to get the advertisement out. I will try to take advantage of Saturday, since that's when y'all know that we typically play, if you will. But I will want to clarify, we will not necessarily be every Saturday, but subscribe to the YouTube page as it floats across the bottom so that you can keep up with these shows. Because again, you can't act right if you don't think right. Think right. Thank you, Brother Ed. See y'all next Saturday. If you will, hang on for a second, Ed, as I end the stream. I'll keep you in the back.